Hi, this is Kat Sturtz from rockingyourpath.com with another episode of Fast Action Fridays. And today my special guest has a topic that followers know I am enthralled with, and that's family history. Learning about our ancestors, talking about what they did and what they didn't do, and talking with those who are still with us today so we get their histories down for future generations. And my guest is Margaret Eves. And Margaret, say hello to everybody.
Hi, everybody. Good to be here.
Tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into this ancestor and this ancestor video thing and all of this wonderful stuff.
Sure. I started out my career working in film, television, and radio. Working in radio and then doing video editing. And that's all about stories. You can't do it without somehow telling a story. That's part of the deal. And I did that for a good number of years, and then I started my family. Both my husband and I are freelancers. He still works in the industry. He's a cameraman. And we decided to start a family, and I stayed home with the family because it's hard to to juggle it all when you're both freelancing. But that was great. That was wonderful. I've got 2 boys. And while I was at home, I actually got interested in genealogy before we had kids and had started doing family history and continued to do the genealogy research. And then this whole time I was interested in research in terms of a career move, and I decided to go back to libraries, to go back to school and get my library science degree, with the plan being that I would work as a school librarian. Mm-hmm. And, thinking I've got kids and I'll be off during the summers. And so I did work as a school librarian, and then that job went away with the recession, and I was in an independent private school. And so then I got a job as a public librarian. And throughout that whole time working as a librarian, I got to teach classes in genealogy. I taught it to middle school students, high school students, and adults. And whenever I taught these classes, I would always bring in a component of presenting what you found and a visual component. I said, you've got to do some kind of presentation. You can do a PowerPoint, you can do a poster, but you got to have pictures or something visual. And it could even be a thing you bring in, but you got to present it and share it. Because I thought there's no point in doing all this research if you don't share it.
Absolutely.
And, so it's like, we're doing this so these folks will be honored and remembered. So those who came before us are honored and remembered. And to me, having come from the field of television and film, I knew the power of visualization in pictures.
And pictures, absolutely.
And, so that's kind of how I got into what I'm doing now. I started my business this year. It's still up and coming, but I just thought this is, there's a little bit out there in terms of people doing the same thing, but I felt like this is really going to be growing, especially in terms of people being able to do things on their own.
Right, absolutely.
We've got tools that make it so easy now.
Right, and you bring up being in school, and of course when you and I were in school, we didn't have the internet. We didn't have PowerPoint, or I didn't anyway. But I remember some of my most vivid memories from school involved a teacher bringing someone in that had an interesting history. I still remember the World War II vet coming into our history class, and he was minus a hand, and he could still tie his shoes faster than any of us in class could with 2 hands. And I can still see him today. If I met him on the street, if he was still alive, I'd probably still recognize him. That's how vivid that memory was.
Right.
You and I talked before we started taping today, because we do tape live, that we have some similar interests and some similar backgrounds. And one that I said I would tell now that I thought you'd enjoy, because you've got this background in TV and a little bit in radio. My great-grandmother, my grandmother, and my aunt were the first ones of females on radio. And
Wow.
Guest, who is the son of famed American poet Edgar Guest, was the first child boy on radio. My great-grandmother had Aunt Betty's Children's Hour in Detroit back in the 1922s. They told her children's and women's voices wouldn't carry on early radio, so she did her own show for a while and kind of proved them wrong. They also thought drums wouldn't go. So that history is there. And of all of my relatives, I'm the only one who really asked her about those things and the only one who did some research with that. So I'm looking forward to learning some tips from you about presenting that for the future, because she's long gone. She passed away in 1968, and all that we have is what I've been able to gather. So I thought,
Oh yeah.
that was interesting.
Okay. Yeah, that's fascinating. And yeah, that she was a trailblazer.
She was. She was actually a graduate of the University of Detroit back when it was very unusual for women to graduate. Had 5 children, my grandmother being one of them. And even my grandmother and my aunt's stories about being children on that show. Of course, everything was recorded or was broadcast live. There's no recording left.
Right. Yeah.
But Detroit newspapers, I was able to go into their morgues and get pictures of some of the early studios with a heavy draping. And I did interview the first man ever on radio. And the Detroit station actually beat the Pittsburgh station, which is in the history books and in the encyclopedias as being the first station. Detroit actually beat them by 6 months, but Pittsburgh had a better, marketing department.
Yeah.
To get out there. But I did interview Elton Plant, who was the first man. He was a 16-year-old that pulled in off the street. He was a courier and said, "Would you like to?" He said, "Sure," not knowing what it was, and suddenly he was on the air and made a career of it.
Oh, wow. That's really cool. And I think you're going in the right direction because you started looking in newspapers.
Yeah.
Newspapers are a really great way to find that context of what was going on at the time.
It was important to me because I had her stories, but I didn't have any validation. I didn't have any verification.
Right.
And in order to share this, I really needed that, even though I believed her. And there were, other family members who remembered it, my grandmother and my aunt. And
Right.
I did get to talk to Bud Guest several times. But his eyesight was failing, and he was old, and his father had passed away. My great grandmother was his dramatic arts tutor, and he was only like 3 or 4 or 5 at the time. So, but he still recognized her picture and called me the minute I showed it to him. So I thought that was really special. All right, so let's get to what do people know? Why is this important to people? How do we start?
Well, I think you touched on something there about the importance in terms of you connected to history because of a person who came in and shared his personal story. And I think that's one of the main reasons why people need to do this. There's 2 main reasons, and it's for our kids, it's for the next generation. First of all, when you share stories like this with your family, even if whether you do it on video or not, but when you share stories about an ancestor and about what they did and what they lived through with your kids, that becomes a part of who they are, and they feel that. That makes them feel like they're part of a group. They're part of, your family, tribe, whatever you want to call it. And that's a very important thing for people to feel. And there have been studies done. There's an author who I saw speak, which was really fun, Bruce Feiler, whose book is, I think it's Walking the Bible, and he's written a book called Secrets of Happy Families. And he talked about a study done at Emory University here in Atlanta where they looked at kids. This was before, they happened to be doing a study of kids before September 11th. And about family stories and what people did during dinner time, it happened to be. And, they would tell family stories. And then as he followed these children after September 11th and things that happened, he found that they were very resilient and stable. And they had that sense of who they were because of who their family was. And also because they felt they could make it through difficult times because they had an ancestor or family member who did as well. And that's one of the main reasons why I like to tell stories to my kids. And you can really you'll see them bring things up, and that's kind of the cool part. But also because by personalizing it, they have a connection to history. It's not just dry dates in a book. It becomes, they know someone or of someone who lived through the Depression or who served during World War I, because they can see the stuff. You can tell the story and then say, this is what they would have done. This is where they would have been. And that's the reason it keeps me going and doing this, because I think that's what people are seeking.
Yeah, I agree. So what kind of fast action tips do you have for somebody who'd like to start on this path?
First of all, a lot of people get overwhelmed when they think of, well, how would I do a video? And, I want to, share my family history. The thing is to really narrow it down. You're not trying to share your whole family history. Let's not try to do roots. It's like, we don't have to make a mini series.
Okay.
Is identify one story. And that can be, I'd say, pick the low-hanging fruit in terms of something you may already have a lot of photographs of a particular person or something they did. Or if it's just, the other option is pick something that is really compelling to you. And I give the example of the first video I did, which was about my Civil War ancestor. And I was kind of aware I had, a great-great-grandfather who served in the Civil War, because it was in a letter my grandfather had written. He had never told me about it, even though I knew my grandpa. And then I started doing the research, and there were military records showing what he had done during the Civil War. And I started, going through these things, and I saw, he was from Savannah, and he had served in this unit around Atlanta. And here I live in the Atlanta area, where they've got historical markers all over the place. And I was like, I didn't know he'd been here. I had no idea. And then I saw where he had been missing in action, and then he was captured, and he was sent to a prisoner of war camp. And I was like, I've got to find out more about this guy. So that's another way to just pick a story that you are passionate about learning about. And so I just started filling in the gaps with, where did he go? And it listed what, prisoner of war camp he was at. And I was able to find information, kind of some amazing photographs.
So much is in a recorded state and can be found.
Yeah, and more and more of it is being made available online. Not everything is, but so much more now is being digitized and put online. And I'll make sure I can give, I've got actually a resource that people can get access to that shows them several of the places where they can go and search for images online. That's half the fun of it. And that's where I go down rabbit holes, is when I start looking for photographs about, a certain time period.
Right, absolutely. I know one of my clients right now is the Garfield Inn, which is a fine dining restaurant and a B&B with ties to our 20th president, James A. Garfield. And I just love the history. And when people want to know more about the era, I get excited sharing what I know about it, and document it. So that's
and that's a good example, is like, pick that one story. You could do a short video about the Garfield Inn.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, you've got all sorts of stuff right there.
Doing it as video, and I know you're going to talk about presentation opportunities, how to do that in presentation mode with a video, but it's so much easier than sitting down to write a book about it.
I find it that way. One thing is, because you're choosing one story, is I encourage people to keep it short. Just write down, really summarize it in just a few sentences. Start off with that, beginning, middle, end. Get that down, and then that's where you can take off from, is with that short outline. Mm-hmm. And, you're, like I said, you're not trying to write a book. You're not trying to do, a multi-part miniseries. you're trying to make maybe a 3 to 4 minute video. It could be a minute, it could be 2 minutes, that's okay. And then, so, the next step is just go ahead and write it down.
So one would be pick one ancestor story to start with.
Yeah.
Two would be write the basics of the story down in a few simple sentences.
Right.
I'll handle that. Okay, 3.
Yeah, so we can do that. And then once you've done that, the next step is think of the visuals that can go with it. What photographs do you have? If you have records, if you have newspaper articles, you could use those because there are ways to make them, in a sense, come alive. If you've ever watched any of the Ken Burns documentary,
Like the Civil War one and
Brooklyn Bridge, he's done a bunch of them, baseball, the national parks. He'll take still photographs and he does that move where you kind of move across, and there are ways in iMovie, which is free on the Mac, you can do what they call the Ken Burns effect. You just pick a point here and then you pick a point where you're going to move to, and it does it for you. But you can do a close-up of certain parts, somebody's signature or an important, part of a record. So pull all those together, and don't forget the artifacts, the things. You might have a toy. We have an ice cream scoop, a big old ice cream spade, a Hamilton Beach heavy-duty thing that my grandpa used when he had a bookstore during the Great Depression, but he also had a soda fountain in the bookstore. So we have his ice cream scoop. Any things like that, you can photograph them or just do video using it or something like that. So think in terms of those visual things. So that's the next thing, is make a list, and also make a list of any audio you might have, or interviews that are already recorded if you've done them. Mm-hmm. Make a list of it.
So this would be kind of like when I wrote to the Detroit newspapers, and I said, this is what I'm looking for. And I had done some freelance writing, so I had a connection with one of the editors who said, I will check with our people who have the morgue, which is the newspaper dead files, so to speak, the research files. And they actually came up with photographs from the 1922 eras of early radio in Detroit. So I've got that. I don't have, obviously my relatives in those pictures, but I do have a true representation of what that studio would have looked like at that time. Right.
Yeah. And again, sometimes you don't have something specific to that person, but you're thinking in terms of the broad picture. What's the context of what they lived in?
Right. And I have pictures of my great-grandmother at the time, and my grandmother and my aunt, and there are ways of putting those together. So you've got a moving story, even if you're showing stills, is what you're saying.
Right. Oh, yeah. I make so many of my videos with still pictures, but you still have a narrative and you have music. That's how many documentarians work. I mean, that's what we're doing, is we're just telling
it really is, to get out of the overwhelm and the scope of this, really bringing this down and just make it step by step, easy. What's the next logical thing to put into place? And I love that you're giving us the step by step, because that's what we're all about here with Fast Action Fridays, is what can we start with and what's the next step we can do.
Right.
What's the next step we can do?
Okay, so the next step, you've made a list of what you have, kind of like an inventory. And then make sure, number 4 is make sure if you have relatives, that older aunt and uncle or whoever, ask them about it. Mm-hmm. They may have something related to it that you just didn't even know about. Mm-hmm. And even, friends of the family, if there's still friends of the family who might have known that person, or go ahead.
That goes from my aunt regarding that early radio, and she recalled the time. My great-grandmother taught radio, and my grandmother played the radio. My aunt sang, so that's what they did on this radio show. But my grandmother never learned to read music. They just pretended to it. My aunt, who could read music, would flip the pages for her, and they were scared to death that Mother, as we called her, would find out that Angela couldn't read music, even though she was playing the piano. She played by ear. She could hear it once and play it. And one time in the studio, according to my aunt, somebody opened a door, all the papers went flying off the piano, and their thought was not about continuing the radio show. Their thought was, what do we do so Mother doesn't find out Angela doesn't know how to read music? Do we stop and pick up the papers, or does she just continue playing? So they decided that my aunt stopped and picked up the papers and put them back up on the piano. I would have never known that without asking about that. I mean, that's not something that would have been recorded in a newspaper article.
No, yeah. And those are great stories because,
So ask relatives. Is there a way to broach that question with relatives, especially if you think something's sensitive with them?
Yeah, and you do have to be careful about that because things that may not seem as much of a big deal to us in current times, they can mean a very big deal and be something that was either embarrassing or whatever to someone who is older and lived during an earlier time, and which is one reason why we may not know about certain stories. We may not discover them until, 100 years after they happened because it just was not talked about in the family. And to us, it may seem, well, it wasn't a big deal, and that's why I do say when you choose a story, when you do anything really related to family history and sharing it, ask if there's someone either who is alive who knew that person or is, still alive, ask them before you share the story. Because, I had my mom's first cousin, when she was alive, would tell me about her mother who had lived with a man. And it was like, this was back in the 1920s, and they actually they got along very well. And actually the grandmother, the mother of this woman kind of accepted this guy. He was still married, but not living with his wife. And it was woo, back, but that was she didn't like to talk about it very much, or, so that was something you just had to keep in mind. That her mother was a fascinating woman. She was an entrepreneur in a time when women didn't. That was
one aspect of her being ahead of her time. So
yes, she was ahead of her time in many ways. And I have a great deal of respect for her because she went out and did a lot of things other women, it was poo-pooed or whatever. But things like that, you just have to be mindful of that. And I want to bring up one more point, because we are, you're going to be using photographs and images. Keep in mind, I'm big on making sure we don't infringe on copyright. And this is like almost a whole nother show to do.
Right, exactly. And I was going to ask you about that. What do we need to be aware of in terms of sharing our family histories?
A general rule, and this is very general, is if it was published in 1922 or before in the United States, international copyright, it varies. Generally, you're okay, and it is considered to be in the public domain. And I say that's a general rule.
Mm-hmm.
So anything after that, it's kind of like you have to be mindful. One thing you can always do is ask permission. And generally with anything I say, just ask permission. Just because it's on the internet does not mean it's free and not under copyright.
Exactly.
So
exactly.
that's the only thing I bring up. And that I always, because I'm a genealogist, and anybody who's doing family history is a genealogist, you cite your source.
Mm-hmm.
Find out where it came from, and as best you can, make a note of where it came from. In all my videos, whether it's at the end or also within, I make a list of where the information came from, because somebody's going to watch that and want to know.
Or want to follow through. I've got one niece following through on my father's side of the family, and we believe we've traced that back to Daniel Boone and the Davidsons going with Daniel into Tennessee early on, and then back as far as the 1600s, which puts them in Mayflower stuff. So,
but unless you've got the sources that make sense and work, it's just family lore. It's like family lore is fun, but
So I know you've got a fifth tip for us.
Okay. So our fifth tip, so we've asked our relatives, and then any photographs, things you get that you're going to use, if they're not already digitized, go ahead and scan them, or you can use a smartphone to take a photograph. That's all you got. People go, what is, scanning? Scanning, you're basically making a copy. If you've got a scanner as part of your printer, you can just scan it and you save it to your computer. And it's not just doing that. You digitize it and you collect them all. And what I usually say is put a copy into your production folder. If you're doing your video story on Uncle Joe, you scan those items and you might have your kind of general full archive, but then you put a copy into the Uncle Joe video folder on your computer. And that way it's all together in that folder so that when you're working on your video, it's real easy to find it.
Right. And it's really important with some of the older documents that you may have. I know some of the early newspaper clippings I have are before we had the acid-free paper. They're crumbling. And luckily, I made copies of them when I first got them. And I've got another copy that's been laminated, so it's not going anywhere. But other than that, you wouldn't be able to see it. So thankfully, we've got libraries digitizing things with the old microfilm, and now in other formats as well.
And if you do have original documents or newspaper clippings, keep those newspaper clippings and old papers away from the photographs. And if you've got anything, actually, digitize it, put it in an archival, good folder. I don't recommend laminating it.
Well, this was like a copy of one. I've got the original from the time that I was given, and then I've got my copies, and then I laminated one of the copies just to have it because it makes it a little easier to find in the file. But I never heard about keeping the photographs away from the newspaper clippings. Is there something about the chemical reaction between the two, or? Yeah,
if you've got old newspaper clippings, they're just turning brown and all that, and you want to keep that away from photographs. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of a general rule as well. But as much as you can digitize things, or if you have the old newspapers, and if you want to have a paper copy, make that paper copy, and then just keep that old stuff kind of separate, because it's got that lignin in there that kind of turns brown, and that's why it turns brown. Newspaper was printed on very cheap paper, and so that's why it'll decompose pretty quickly.
Right. Now, I know you've got a bonus tip for us.
Oh, my bonus tip. Again, I talk about making a note of where photographs, especially, when you digitize that photograph, I know within Mac files, and I think with Windows, there's another way to do it. But when I see the file, if I see all those files in my folder, if I right click on it, and it'll show a list of choices, things you can do. One of them says Get Info. If you click on that, it's going to open up a box where it gives you the metadata about that file, that JPEG file or TIFF file. And that allows you, there's usually a comment section in there, and that's where I'll type in the information about where it came from, the source citation.
Right. Excellent.
Yeah.
Wow.
And even if I'm using an online archive and I find a photograph that is indeed in the public domain, if I'm going to use it in a video, if it's a personal thing, you could probably use it. But if it's in the public domain and I download it, a lot of times these online archives will provide you with the citation formatted very nicely. And so I'll just copy and paste that into my comments. So that way, that's a pretty good way to kind of keep that information going with the digital file, because you don't really have a way, if you're just trying to see the photo, of saving the source citation. I know some people will actually create, when they open the file, it'll show the photograph, and underneath that, they almost create it like a PDF or they'll type it in. And you can
I've done like a screenshot.
Yeah.
And snag it to write
Yeah.
write things down.
Yeah.
But
Which
I
is
anyway, and
yeah.
that never occurred to me, as techie as I am. That never occurred
Yeah.
to me.
Which is sort of a kind of just a low-tech way of, you make a Word document, you slap the picture in there, and then you type something underneath it, which is fine for, I guess, research. But when you're trying to use a photograph within a video, it's got to be just that JPEG file.
Right, absolutely.
So yeah, that is helpful because when you're going to do your credits at the end, you've got that information there that you can put into your organizer, which is one of the things I offer in my starter kit.
Tell us about that starter kit. I am so excited to get my hands on this. I mean, as much as I've done, I'm a learning girl. I never stop learning, and history, and especially family histories, whether it's my own or somebody else's, just captivates me. So I'm really excited to get my hands on this. So tell us what it is, how to get it, and we will have the link in the replay so people can get this. But what can we expect?
And one thing I want to encourage people to do, since this is going to be probably, they'll be seeing this the day after Thanksgiving.
Yeah.
Is you're going to have family around, or you'll have had family and they've been telling stories, is get that information down now before you forget about it.
Yeah.
And if somebody's still there, if you've still got, some relatives there, sit them down, grab your cell phone. There's a voice memo, or, a smartphone has ways to record it. You can either record audio or you can do, video.
Mm-hmm.
What we're doing right now on Zoom, you can get we're using the Zoom platform. If you go to zoom.us, I love that because you can have a free Zoom account and you can have one-on-one meetings with people for free for unlimited amounts of time, which they changed that. I thought it was only 40 minutes, but free now it's one person.
A limited number of sessions, but I think they're still limited to how long they are.
Oh, okay.
So it's like you can do, I believe 6 hours in a day, which nobody's going to do that many.
Yeah.
So you just have one and you restart it and you can continue. The cost is a problem. I happen to have the pro account with some of the extra bells and whistles.
Yeah.
And in my time, I can record continuously for 6 hours or something.
Right. But it's a great way if somebody's not with you, you send them the link and then you can get on together and chat, and then that can be your raw footage. They tell a great story and you get their permission, you can put it into a video and then use photographs to edit into that.
Okay. And do you recommend getting like regular model release or copyright release forms from family, or is verbal okay, especially if it's non-truly sensitive stuff? Or what's the protocol on this?
That's a good question, because most of my videos have been about dead people. I tend to focus on the people who lived a long time ago. I would probably a written, just, hey, is it all right if we use your image since it is among family? That might be, not a bad idea, as if, if you have somebody who's like a little wavering, just don't, you can quote them. And I also ask permission to quote people, because I don't want anyone to get upset about that. So I would err on the side of caution when it comes to that. I mean, you could probably download a model release form, but then we're getting into commercial use and things like that. And generally, most of what you're doing is going to be for personal family sharing.
Right.
But
now,
you ask permission.
I've got a question that I'm not sure you're going to see coming, or maybe with your background you will. We have so many wonderful families adopting children, Do you have advice for children who may not have a direct tie to research their blood roots, so to speak? How important are their adopted family stories? How can we help a child or an adult follow their natural roots back if they're interested? Any tips or advice on that?
Yeah, I'll mention two things. First of all, I've done a video, and I know people do videos for families that adopt a child. They tell the story, and I think that's really important for an adopted child. A neighbor of mine, I did a video about when she went to China and adopted her daughter. And every time I'd run into her on the street, she'd say, you know, she keeps watching that video over and over again because, oh my gosh, it's your story.
Yes.
And as far as being able to research biological parents, there are, usually within a state, there are groups that will help with that. That's a really specialized form of research, and state by state varies as far as the laws having to do with contacting, you know, biological parents. It really varies. Some are open, some are closed, some they have ways. Some states do have people, you know, you can contact people who are like designated agents in a way. They can be the go-between to try to contact the biological parent to see if they'd be interested. And usually there's a state agency that deals with that, but it varies again state to state. And because I've looked at that before, because I had a friend who was adopted and I was wondering what she would do.
Mm-hmm.
But it was, you know, you could probably do a search on, you know, adoptees and genealogy. But generally, if you want to look for the group within the state, and sometimes it is through the state agency of how that's handled, because each state law is different.
All right. So in your Ancestor Video Starter Kit, do you have links to where people can go to start some of their searches, other than starting with, you know, their regular family members and what they might find in their attics?
Right. A bonus that I have within my starter kit, and I'll just quickly go over what's in the starter kit.
Sure.
You'll get a video of called why use video to share your genealogy, which kind of gives you some of the good reasons and why it's so effective. You'll also get a transcript of the video, which is kind of nice. I also give you a checklist of kind of like what we went over just now, the steps to go through at the beginning, and where to look for images. And I also include an e-booklet that's called, it's the 7 sites for great images from your ancestors' world. And that's 7 different places that have historical images, many of them in the public domain. And when you get that e-booklet, there's places where you can click directly to go to, there's things like the Digital Public Library of America, which is an awesome portal to hundreds of different archives. Mm-hmm. There's New York Public Library has a wonderful digital collection. Library of Congress is one of my favorite places, and there's some others like that. So that booklet is a bonus in there. You'll also be giving you an organizer table, or not a table, but it's an organizer for when you start doing your video, of where you write down your story. And again, when you're doing video, you think shot by shot. So it's kind of a shot by shot organizer. And what image you'll see with that little part of your story, and then where you start making note of your sources, and you're going to create titles to go with it, so that as you're working on your video, when you get to where you're editing and finishing, it all comes together. You've got your organizer, it's all planned out, and it makes it easy for you to edit it together.
Oh, I love that. I have a wonderful cousin out in California that put together the Goward side, my mother's side, our history, and bound it all up for us for a reunion we had several years ago, and it's just so nice. And she's got it organized pretty much the way you mentioned. Now it'd be nice to take some of those individual stories and do a little video story for each of those. Those people.
Yeah, well, that's a great starter point.
You and I could talk all day about this. I know I could, because I'd love to hear more stories about the things you've uncovered, and I've got other stories that I could share, and I'm really excited to be able to offer my followers your Ancestor Video Starter Kit, and looking forward to seeing what they come up with and the stories they uncover and share, because as you mentioned earlier, it's not enough just to uncover it and know about it. The real treasure is in presenting it and making sure other people have access to it, right?
Right, and that's what carries it on through the generations. If you lose that link, I mean, it may as well be gone.
The Titanic.
Until somebody might happen upon it in, the next generation or generations, but this helps and hopefully ensure that it will be carried on.
Right, and it's a great reminder that we never know how long we have here on this physical earth. So if there's somebody you want to ask a question to about their history, about what they went through, don't wait. I mean, I am so glad that at the age between 11 and 13 that I had conversations with my great-grandmother. And I had other cousins that lived with her, or she lived with them, and kind of knew about it, but had no interest in exploring it. And I find it fascinating that I'm the only one who actually asked the questions, and enough questions that I'm now able to follow up some of those stories.
Yeah. And sometimes you just have to ask sort of those open-ended questions.
Yeah.
Because you never know what that kind of things they might have done. My mom still surprises me. My mom's 90 years old, and she'll still come up with stuff. I'm like, what? I had no idea.
Well, I know there's some great stories on my husband's side too of when his great-grandparents came over from Poland. I still can't say their original Polish last name. It got Americanized in Ellis Island, and all I know is that the grandfather said, I don't care how they spell it, I just want them to let me stay. So he took it the way they wrote it. So there are people that think we might be relatives, but we aren't, because he wasn't really that name. It was a name. So.
Yeah, and that's something that's common. People, even in their own lifetime, just change the way they spell their names.
Well, and it's fun finding out things. Like, I always thought my great-grandmother, her parents were from County Cork, Ireland. But then I found out that was a great shipping out area, that they weren't actually from that area.
Right, yeah.
It's like, ooh, new information. Well, thank you so much, Margaret, for being with me today and sharing this wonderful information about family history and how we can record and preserve the stories about our heritage. And we can also share our own stories going forward. It doesn't have to be about another relative. I suppose we could start sharing some of our own stories as well.
Right. Oh, yeah. Yeah. But it was great fun. Thank you for having me, Kat.
We'll definitely have to have you back. This is Kat Sturtz from rockingyourpath.com, closing another episode of Fast Action Fridays, and looking forward to having you with me next week. And as always, reminding you to keep rocking your unique path to success.